Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different media, books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, mechanics, etc. is out unless they relate directly to how the story is being told. I am Daniel Radford, author, drow, and also your host. And today, the other individual in my minuscule adventuring party is once again John Kernan.
Hello, it's me. I'm um fictional.
That's right. John is completely in your head. He's not real. I've been doing this podcast alone the entire time, talking to nobody.
I'm that little spark of joy and wonder and proper appreciation for cheese that exists deep in everybody's heart.
Not in mine.
But you can hear me. It's there somewhere.
Yeah, everyone's got like a little angel, a little devil, and this is just my equivalent. Anyway,
I you'd be pretty lucky if your devil on the shoulder is just going, "Hey, how about some cheese?"
and also homicide. Okay, can we backtrack?
What what that first part was okay. What'd you say after that?
So yes, after our series of darker or more grounded themes, because we did a few this season, we're going into something that is theoretically, anyway, a bit more wondrous and whimsical for our final cycle of the season, that being fantasy.
One of the biggest genres there's ever been.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one, so I am excited to break it down, which we will do nowish.
Yeah. Fantasy is kind of broad. A lot of people, when they think of fantasy nowadays, almost immediately think of like the medieval-ish fantasy. The problem with calling it medieval is it's an age, and there's a lot of things that feel medieval to people but aren't technically. But point is, most people when they think of fantasy, they think of magic, lots of big forests, not very developed technology and industry, and elves, dwarves, sometimes hobbits, but mostly elves and dwarves, goblins,
Orcs.
all that, orcs.
Yeah, fantasy is extremely broad, and defining it is a good place to start. So, fantasy is actually one of several genres that falls under the wider umbrella of something called speculative fiction, which is the same group that includes things like sci-fi slash sci-fantasy, post-apocalyptic stories, magical realism, alternate history, supernatural horror, utopia, dystopia. But generally speaking, fantasy, sci-fi, and horror are generally considered to be more or less the big three of that bunch. Basically, though, anything that exists outside the bounds of normal reality is speculative fiction. And things that can't or don't exist in the world as we know it. And fantasy makes up a very, very large chunk of that pie chart.
It's a massive chunk of it, partially because of how broad it is, and partially because of just how popular it's gotten. I mean, it's one of the genres that a ton of people read exclusively. There are so many people out there who mostly only indulge themselves in fantasy. Hell, I think for a long time, the only books I was reading on my own, like for fun, were fantasy before I got into anything else when I was younger.
Yeah, fantasy is definitely one of the biggest genres and one of the ones that is most like widely consumed and most widely understood. Fantasy is the stuff that occurs in a make-believe usually world or some like alternate world. It's the one which includes magic and mythological beings and strange creatures. We all know what fantasy is, but do we is the question because I think when you really look into the like history of the fantasy genre and the specifics of how broad it actually is, I think a lot like when we talked about drama, a lot of people would be surprised by how expansive fantasy as a genre is, how long it has existed, and what actually fits under that umbrella. Because, I mean, fantasy has existed for an extremely long time. It is actually an ancient genre. You wouldn't think it because so much of what we think of as fantasy is defined by very modern standards and modern tropes. But, consider the Iliad and the Odyssey. Whilst they were definitely blended by real world historical events and the religious beliefs of the time, they were also largely fictionalized versions of the events of those eras, and they involved things like magic artifacts, superhuman feats of strength and skill, and magical beings and deities constantly getting involved in mortal lives to disastrous effect. That sounds a lot like fantasy to me.
Yeah, it sure is. I mean, heck, looking at a lot of the things Odysseus does and how he does them, I mean, back then at least, Odysseus might as well be the Greek Link from Legend of Zelda if he could talk a god into bed, which, looking at some of the interactions he has in his games, he probably could.
Yeah, the man was noted for having a silver tongue.
Yep. And Link has giant fairy ladies thirsting after him, so
It's
checks
basically the
out.
same guy.
Checks out.
But that's not the only example, right? We also have things like 1001 Nights, also called Arabian Nights. Something is a more familiar name for it, which it's a very similar boat. It's a very old series of stories that draws on folk tales from the Islamic world, and it gave us iconic characters like Aladdin and Sinbad, and their stories are full of weird magic and monsters.
True. Yeah, they've got a lot of the classic fantasy elements. I think the only reason more people don't think of that stuff as fantastical is because of its religious inspirations and being so old that to some people it is a part of I shouldn't say the religious canon, but some people who either don't know it that well or just grew up with it a lot just feel like it is a normal thing that's there, a part of it. It doesn't feel fantastical to them anymore, but it certainly is.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're not wrong. Back then, a lot of fantasy was blended in with religion and mythology, or took a lot of inspiration from it. The oldest story, the oldest written story we know of, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a fantasy story. It is the story of a guy seeking immortality, basically. And whilst it's relatively light on the fantasy elements, it also borrows a lot from the religious beliefs of the time in constructing its narrative. Like, there are figures from those old religions and old folk tales of the time that appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh as characters.
That's a good point, yeah.
But it is technically a fantasy story. It's a guy going on an epic quest in search of a magic goal, coming into contact with supernaturally long-lived beings and magic artifacts, and coming into contact with deities and things like that. And it's also the foundation for one of the earliest tropes we had in a way, because the Epic of Gilgamesh is also the one of the earliest instances, in fact, the earliest written of everything, so obviously, but one of the oldest instances we have of the hero's journey, which is also deeply interwoven with fantasy literature.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's so strong. It's become like the closest to a basic bare bones blueprint of writing a story that there generally is.
Yeah. And further down the line, you've got stuff like Beowulf as well, which is another epic poem that was very inspirational for Tolkien, and thus also very foundational to fantasy as we know it. It's a genre that we don't think of as being old and ancient, really, because, like you said, a lot of it is very intertwined with folk tales and mythology. But we've been telling fantasy stories for a very long time. It's just that what we think of as fantasy stories now tend to fit more neatly into the boxes we have created. But it's a very, very old, very broad genre. Just running down the list, fantasy is not just limited to elves and dwarves and orcs, which is your high fantasy, so epic fantasy sort of sorcery stuff. It's also can be dark or gothic. It can be mixed with sci-fi to become sci-fantasy, a la Star Wars. There's your obligatory reference for the day, guys.
In fact, that's actually a really big spectrum too, which is weird because there's not a whole lot of sci fantasy things, and yet the two biggest examples I can think of are so far apart on the spectrum, and that's Star Wars and Warhammer 40K.
Yeah, those are two very different vibes.
They're so different.
But that's exactly it. Even in that one niche subgenre, which is actually a subgenre of two genres, I guess, but there's a huge spectrum. Then you've got, contemporary and urban fantasy, which is where a lot of YA stuff falls under. That's where you've got your like Percy Jackson series, which, as a note, also borrows a lot from mythology.
Surprise, surprise.
You've got portal fiction, or the modern incarnation of that stemming from out of Japan, which has become very popular isekai. Then you've got your low fantasy stuff, like their words, A Song of Ice and Fire slash Game of Thrones. Fairy tales are fantasy. They're about as fantastical as it gets. Their stories all about weird magical shenanigans.
Yeah, yeah, very true. I mean, to a certain point, all a story really needs to be fantasy is to have at least one major element to it that like isn't specifically in another genre or exclusive to another genre and couldn't exist in reality, is in some whimsical or fantastical way impossible in our world as we know it.
Yeah, basically, if that comes from technology, it's sci-fi. If that comes from magic and mythological sources like the divine, it's fantasy. And a lot of things that you wouldn't even consider fantasy are actually fantasy. I mean, ma it's weird to me that magical realism is frequently considered separate because it's literally in the name that it's just what if magic but realism. Two big ones, supernatural horror and superhero media, are also very much rooted in fantasy.
That's true. Yeah, it is. They are fantasy, and in a lot of cases, they are fantasies since superheroes are always supposed to be aspirational and inspirational or anti-aspirational in some way or another, some key way.
I mean, if their powers are natural to them, they're fantasy. Or if they're like a divine being like Thor, I guess that's fantasy. Obviously, characters like the Fantastic Four or Iron Man who get it through sci-fi means that's sci-fi. But sci-fi and fantasy blend together very well, and we know this. But horror. So much of horror is secretly fantasy.
Yeah,
Anytime it's a ghost or a ghoul or an ancient eldritch horror, that's fantasy. Basically all of Lovecraftian horror, all of supernatural horror, all of that is technically fantasy.
that's one of the things that's great about the baseboard broader genres is they're so broad and so much about a feeling or one main element that a lot of them, despite being the bigger genres, can blend into each other and coexist because the elements they need to be what they are don't clash with each other at all.
No, fantasy is honestly one of the genres that's easiest to blend with other things. It lends itself surprisingly well to being combined with, well, sci-fi, because it can be the source of a bunch of technology, like weird magic, psionic shit. We've
Hmm.
established that supernatural horror, ghost stories, is just fantasy, but scary. Fantasy worlds also lend themselves to things like political dramas, stories about utopian or dystopian societies, types of apocalypse, and very prominently, romance is a huge part of fantasy genre these days and historically.
Yeah, pretty much the only genre of fantasy really can't blend with at all is, of course, nonfiction.
Yeah, basically. Like there's even historical fantasy where people inject notes of like supernatural arcane elements into historical fiction.
That's true. That's always fun too, because no matter what you do, you're gonna have to deal with the people who are gonna be like, "Well, no, that's just how it really happened.
Yeah.
That was true."
Yeah, there is literally nothing you can't blend with fantasy because all fantasy is this broad catch-all term for stories that are speculative and not based in technology. That they are based in the magical and the divine.
Yeah, the biggest reason fantasy is so prolific, I feel like is because it's also the I feel like fantasy is the genre whose motivation comes closest out of like the main genres to being one of the two most basic foundational motivations there can be to write anything. Because of course the biggest divide before we get to everything else, right, is just fiction or nonfiction. And the two motivations for that are simply I want to record something that is real and I want to create something that's not.
Basically.
And the motivation for fantasy is only one tiny step down from that, and literally, I want to create something fantastic.
Yeah, I want to create something that can't be real, almost.
Yeah, yeah, basically. I want to create something that couldn't be real.
The funny thing is though, like that doesn't bar it from looking into very real philosophies and topics and things like that. Just because the setting is fantastic doesn't mean the ideas it's exploring can't be. Half the time, fantasy is just a really creatively inspired and therefore easy to consume way of communicating an idea that you want to beat into people's skulls. And if it's comes in this pretty parcel or often grim parcel of this wonderful, fantastical, intriguing world with these complicated societies and deep lore and all this built into it, people are going to naturally dive into that and just sort of assimilate those ideas into themselves, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah, it goes both ways. We take elements from even the fictional and the amazing fantastical stories into ourselves, whether we realize it or not. And the same way, everybody can't help but put at least some of themselves into anything they write. After all, it's coming from you, which means the same influences that made you who you are in the real world are going to find a way to bleed their way into your writing one way or another.
Yeah, a lot of the time, fantasy is just metaphor, really.
Yeah,
It's just metaphor taken to the logical extreme.
it really is. I mean, some of them are so direct. There are fantasy stories out there that are literally like one person's thoughts and feelings on a specific country's politics, or sometimes even some big specific event they have strong feelings on that they're like, yeah, but I want to make something out of this and flex my brain with where it could go or how a different group of people deal with it or even just put a fantastical spin on it and create my own version of it instead of just pontificating on the real thing.
Yeah. I mean, hell, way back in season one, I wrote a fantasy story about magic that grew on trees in the form of these weird fruit things or seed things, and the plot of that story was basically this guy was harvesting them as his job, and another group were like, "Yes, we would like those because they're powerful." Wow, a natural resource that creates potent energy that people fight over. Never heard that before.
No, never heard that. Oh, oh.
But that's the thing, right? With like it does kind of beg the question, right? With all this diversity and versatility that can all these different things that fantasy can be, why the hell do some people just adamantly despise the idea of consuming fantasy media? And there's two reasons that I'm very eager to get into today, and the first one of those is that it's all Tolkien's fault.
Yeah, I mean, I love Tolkien and I love Lord of the Rings, but it kind of is his fault just by virtue of how successful and prolific Lord of the
Yeah,
Rings
it's like
was.
okay, it's not really Tolkien's fault. He didn't set out to do this, but in a lot of ways, it does start from him.
He succeeded too much.
Yeah, we're suffering from his success because he basically invented modern fantasy. Now, obviously, fantasy stories, as we've established, existed a long time before him. But the general perception of fantasy as we know it mostly stems from him. The general framework, stems from him. Now, he had his own inspirations. He was inspired by Beowulf. He was inspired by Christian and Nordic mythology. The works of John Ruskin and George MacDonald also played a part in developing his writing style, and he even had contemporaries who were doing fantasy at the same time as him. C.S. Lewis, rather famously, was a good friend of his. Robert E. Howard, who did Conan the Barbarian, had some back and forth with him, and there was a little bit later, but Ursula K. Le Guin with I think it's Guin, who did Earthsea, came into the picture eventually as well. So it's not like he was the only foundational creator of the fantasy genre, but he was so much more widely successful than any of the other ones that the reason so much of fantasy now looks like it does can be attributed to the success of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. That's why there's so many elves, dwarves, magic swords, wizards, and dragons.
Yeah, and like, don't get me wrong, any almost any great fantasy writer is going to have a decent amount of philosophical thinking, but like in addition to being a very successful writer, Tolkien was also like an avid and vocal philosopher who thought and wrote a lot about such things, which, to be fair, is probably inevitable for any creative person who goes through one of the world wars.
Or in general, to be fair.
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course, but
But
like, yeah, he
especially if you were in the trenches of the Somme.
the man had been through a lot and he had a lot of thoughts and feelings he shared with. So I'm sure in some ways directly and in many, many ways indirectly, he was a mentor to a lot of up and coming writers. And I'm sure most of them didn't just directly ape things from Lord of the Rings. A lot of that influence actually comes from audience perception to the point where there are a lot of people now who like they think of elves, they immediately think of the elves as from Lord of the Rings, even if they've never read it. They think of dwarves, they think of those dwarves. They think of hobbits, they think of those hobbits, not halflings, which is more like a slur for hobbits in Lord of the Rings. Which, to be fair, it never sounded nice to begin with, the word halfling. But like those all existed before Lord of the Rings. I
Well,
don't remember. I
hobbits not
need to
so
double
much.
ch
I think hobbits were a Tolkien original, but
Well, that's why I said it because it's also definitely intentional that he made like an insulting name for the hobbits in Lord of the Rings, something that did exist before, because halflings very much were a fantasy thing before.
yeah, well, I mean, gnomes, goblins, leprechauns, funny little guys existed, yes.
Yeah, and they were all frequently very, very different. In most of their older depictions, elves were a type of fairy,
Hmm.
and in some of them, so were dwarves.
Well, dwarves largely come from the Nordic side, in fairness,
That
where
that's true,
the Fey stuff is more Celtic.
especially in The Hobbit. They start bringing them seeming a little more down to earth in Lord of the Rings itself. Although I think that's probably just because Lord of the Rings has much more of the oh, this world is dying and becoming less magical element to them because the dwarves in almost every depiction of them that ever exists are either a dying or strong but faded race. The elves frequently are too, but the dwarves it always feels even more like, wow, their heyday sure was a long time ago. There's a lot of stuff they used to do that they don't anymore. Um, any whoozle, suffice it to say, there's a lot of people who don't even realize that the defaults to them from fantasy are directly from Tolkien's depiction, and that a lot of other people who have different depictions of those from him, they don't have different depictions from the norm. They just have different depictions from him because there hasn't been like a super clear norm for what those creatures are for a long time, other than Tolkien through sheer popularity.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing though. Purely because of how successful it is and how widespread his idea of what all these things are, so much of fantasy, whether intentional or not, is trying to just recapture the magic of the Lord of the Rings, or to put their own concepts, their own spin on the concepts he introduced to the wider world. And that means a lot of people only really think of fantasy as Tolkien-esque because a lot of it is. And that's why a lot of it feels very formulaic because there's a tendency, well, I mean, there's also a tendency to depend on YA and romance tropes these days or to retell the hero's journey. But as a general rule, all of that could also be found in Tolkien's work too. So whether they're doing it on purpose or not, people are very much latching onto all these ideas that stem from this one guy, which, again, he had his own influences and things like that, but it causes people to not realize that fantasy can do so much more than that default. In fact, some people don't even realize that a lot of the media they have consumed and enjoyed even is fantasy.
Yeah. A lot of people consume fantasy without realizing it's fantasy because the idea of it to many people has become much more rigid than what it is.
And that's why I say it's strange almost that there are so many people who are like, ugh, fantasy, not that shit. Oh God, don't like fantasy. It's like, really? But you read Stephen King.
Yeah. A lot of people who would be like, fantasy would just really actually mean that they don't like high fantasy or that maybe they don't like portal fantasy or
Yeah,
isekai. Like this,
exactly.
a lot of people they have one version of it in their head that's been everywhere because most versions of fantasy have been everywhere at some point because it's so huge that they'll latch on to that one thing they don't like and be like, ugh, God, keep all of it away from me. And it's like, yeah, well, what about this one over here? You like that one, right? Because that's fantasy.
Yeah, like it. There are genuinely people out there who will, in the same breath, be like, "Yeah, no, I love Star Wars, or I love Castlevania, or I love it, or The Conjuring, or Cloverfield, or any number of other things," and then be like, but I don't really like fantasy." I'm like, it's like, but you just said, but what?
Excuse me?
What do you think that is? That's a story about a vampire.
I love Avatar: The Last Airbender. Thank God it's not fantasy.
That's even a very specific subgenre of fantasy called Shenmue, I think it is, which is basically fantasy derived from the spiritual side of martial arts. It's originally a Chinese thing.
Yeah, it's more or less what if the spiritualism could physically manifest effects on the world directly.
Yeah. If you've ever fired off a Hadouken in Street Fighter, congratulations, you've participated in fantasy.
Yeah, I'm sorry to tell all of the Ryu fans out there. All simultaneously 8 billion of them, but probably also only 5 because he is the boy. He is the poster.
It's so funny that so many people have consumed and enjoyed fantasy media without even realizing it. But again, this is something we talked about a lot when we did our cycle on drama, is that people have this very preconceived notion, this very specific formulaic idea. Even people creating the genre, or stories in the genre, I should say, have this very locked in idea, this very neat, narrow box of what fantasy is, but it is actually one of, if not the broadest genre available to us.
Yeah, it's one of the big problems we have to deal with in the modernization of language is I know we've talked about at least once or twice before about how, words change over time in society and how people generally use them. And there's nothing you can do about that. To a point, new uses and meanings for words are valid simply because if they're going to get used anyways, you can't just other than certain examples where it is literally just using a word completely wrong. Just because a new definition is different, you can't just say it's wrong because if people are going to be using it all over the place and you can't stop it, it effectively, by rule of social law, does also mean that,
But if you say literally what you mean figuratively, you can still go fuck yourself.
yeah, like, I mean, and literally when you think about it, no, when you think about it, you run into a complication because even if the new definitions are valid, they don't invalidate the old definitions. And it's easy for people to think that way when you hear someone using a word a way you're not familiar with anyone that's using it. But the problem is with how many different concepts and interpretations and just ways to communicate thoughts and ideas that humans have, the old definitions of words also can't be allowed to just die because less people are using them, because a lot of times even their broader meanings existed for a specific purpose, and those meanings themselves, especially with older words, would disappear if they weren't recorded and if people stopped using the old definitions altogether. So the old definitions, especially for things like genre terms, always have to be valid. We have to keep them in mind because that's the thing. That's the baseboard that the other things spring off of. When you choose only one narrow interpretation of it and you let that be the only thing you stick with, at that point, you will essentially be using it wrong because you won't understand people that are trying to communicate a simple and old idea to you anymore.
Yeah, it's one of those things. This is part of why I am so cautious about using genre labels with my own writing, right? Is that people have very preconceived ideas of what things are, and I'm not trying necessarily to fit into those boxes. I often do, just by default, but I'm not setting out to write a specific genre 9 times out of 10. I have an idea and I'm going to write that story. I honestly think genres are much more useful from a marketing perspective than they are from a storytelling perspective, because it's
They are.
when you set out to be like, I'm going to write a fantasy story, and you start thinking of the default fantasy world, and like that's when you end up writing something that is incredibly formulaic and derivative. And it can still be good in theory.
Yeah, especially and it can. And those labels also they tend to be more useful like post-op, post-writing. If you
Yeah.
give yourself the label before you even start, you may be accidentally putting yourself in a box the whole way.
I will always advocate for writing the story you want to write, and then figure out things like the appropriate audience and the technical genre of it after.
Every idea has an audience.
Yeah. Is it the best way to do things from a marketing perspective? Maybe not, but from just a pure like creative standpoint, I think that you're going to write more original stories, more you stories, if you're not setting out to fit yourself into a box in the very beginning. But we digress a bit. There's another thing, and this is honestly one of the saddest ones for me, right? But there is another thing that turns people off from fantasy and prevents them from giving it a try or acknowledging that they're even consuming fantasy media from me. And that is that whilst it is blessedly going away, there is a conception of fantasy as being childish or for kids. And there is historical precedent for it in a way, because a lot of this perception stems from the fact that old fantasy stories were typically fables or fairy tales aimed at kids to communicate certain ideas to them or morals to them, like parables, or they were whimsical stories like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland that were designed to entertain children and keep them busy, because this was hundreds of years before they had smartphones.
Man, crazy that Through the Looking Glass was made to entertain children.
Never mind that fantasy stories obviously had existed for hundreds upon hundreds of years before someone decided to come up with the wishing chair, and that those older stories were very much for adults, or at least for everyone. You know, even The Lord of the Rings, which is a story about how greed and a lust for power corrupt mortal beings and pushed them towards abuse, war, and heinous atrocities, was lumped in with children's media for a long time, and often still is, because of this perception developed of whimsical fairy tale fiction being for teaching and entertaining kids.
Don't forget about how the advancement of industry is direct opposition to the flow of nature and life on the earth and is going to kill us all one day. He
Yeah,
he cared he cared a lot about that one. People like to try to look away from that part when they're consuming Lord of the Rings.
it's so funny to me that one of the most evil companies on the planet in modern times literally called themselves Paladin.
I know. I still can't believe it. For anybody, we've talked about it before. For anybody who hasn't seen that episode or doesn't remember, the real company Palantir, which is supposedly supposed to be watching us and protecting us and isn't just blatantly and evilly spying on us, is named after the evil spy on people orb from Lord of the Rings.
It's fucking wild that they did that and no one is keyed onto the fact that they are just evil as shit. It's so funny.
I my jaw dropped the
How
first
did they
time
get
I
away with
saw that.
this?
I was like, wait, is there some older definition of the word I didn't see? And then I looked at it and the spelling was even exactly the same. And I was like, no, no, you can't just do that in public. And
And
that's just
yet,
what it is. Oh,
but yeah, it's so sad that people look at a story like The Lord of the Rings, which has so much moral and political complexity to it, and go, "Eh, it's for kids because it's got magic and dragons." And we are kind of shaking that stigma off a little bit now in the modern day. George R. R. Martin letting his characters fuck, swear, and do war crimes definitely helped, as did other similarly gritty, low magic takes on the genre. And
mm-hmm.
also just a growing number of adults openly embracing the nerdier side of fiction and nerdier hobbies. I think all of that has definitely contributed to shaking the stereotype some, but it does still persist to an extent, and it's really quite sad because it's like people cannot some people just cannot allow themselves to consume this entire ancient branch of storytelling full of incredible narratives and deeply complex characters and settings because there's a magic wand in it maybe, and that is for children.
Yeah,
Never mind that it's
yeah.
not, but
That's something my dad used to do. He was one of those men with the weird divide that he actually liked Lord of the Rings and he liked a lot of fictional things, but also then he could look at most cartoons and be like, well, this is stupid. How can you watch this? It's not real.
as if any other fiction is.
Yeah, exactly. I always found that weird. I think what he really meant for the most part was there's not enough realism and my thought, even though I couldn't quantify it to actually argue with him at the time when I was a kid, was always just kind of like, what is real enough? What is too fake, not real? Like I don't. He could watch Courage the Cowardly Dog with me. He didn't say that one wasn't real because he liked it.
Yeah. We talked a bit about that a bit on Fixation in the first season of that. That was
Yeah,
so much fun. But it is often weird. Like it is definitely more men who hold on to that view for whatever reason, probably because of societal conditioning that we have to be stoic, grounded, productive, and productivity focused people or whatever. But it's not unique to men. But it is definitely more common with men, and especially men of like the older generations.
well, you know, the old toxic traditional philosophies are stronger or are dominant, I should say, within men because men are dominant within the old
Yeah,
traditional
but it
philosophies.
it's always seems so strange to me, right? Because fantasy is also full of characters that embody those ideals for one thing.
Yeah, that's
The
true.
traditional heroic figure is a stoic, physically strong, skilled, and productive man, usually. Like,
All the manliest men I know are fictional.
yeah. But also somehow it's more believable that fucking I don't know, Ethan Hunt or Jason Bourne can or John Wick insert soldier slash spy protagonist here can punch, shoot, and stab their way through 100 guys and come out of it with a sore shoulder and a limp. Somehow that's more believable than a guy dropping a fireball into a room full of goblins. I'm like, this is just as bullshit.
It is, but because there's real people who've done a softer, less numbers version of that same thing, people can digest it a little easier.
I guess. I mean, Greek fire
It's because
existed. That's,
that's true.
I mean, yeah, that's chemistry, but that was quotation marks magic fire that wouldn't go out on water that we still haven't figured out how it worked to this day.
Yeah, that's true. No, it ultimately just comes down to like a lot of little things like modernization. it's easier for somebody to call it realistic to see, oh, man with no superpowers did thing with a gun. I've seen guns. Those exist.
Yeah, or but it's also, a lot of those people are also completely fine with like a Marvel movie. Now they'd never read a comic, of course, but they're completely fine with a Marvel movie, and it's like you can believe that Tony Stark in a cave with scraps made the fucking Iron Man suit. You can suspend your sense of disbelief enough for that, but you can't for Gandalf.
Yeah, that's true. This man with a terminal disease is being kept alive by the world's most powerful and efficient energy generator being thrust into his chest.
Like you can suspend your sense of disbelief for Jesus coming back to life, but you can't do it for Ian McKellen.
I want Ian McKellen to come back to life.
I mean, he's not dead yet at the time of
No,
recording.
sorry, I
Let's
want
just
Christopher
let's
Lee to
just
come back to life. Ian McKellen's just incredibly old.
and would probably laugh in the face of all of these people who are so derisive about fantasy media, as would Christopher Lee.
Oh yeah, I've seen it. They have.
It's just so strange to me that, people are so, and we said this is again when we did the drama cycle, we talked about it a bit when we talked about horror a little bit, that there are people who are just so unwilling to try any media that isn't the same generic slop.
Yeah. Don't ever put yourself in a strict little box of your enjoyment where you can only enjoy a couple things. Not just because it's probably not true, but you deserve better. Do you want to be limited in that way? Do you want to be shackled and not be al because once you think you only like those things, that's already dangerously, it's one tiny step away from not being allowed to enjoy other things. And everybody deserves better than that.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, how many people, I wonder, would actually get really into like deep into fantasy storytelling, right down to, fucking TTRPGs even, if they weren't shackled by the idea of how other people would judge them for being into fantasy ideas. And again, it's getting better, but even now, there's a lot of people who probably look at that sort of stuff and are like, it's not for me. I don't want to get judged for like it." It's just sad because so many of the best stories, like throughout history, are technically fantasy
Yeah, it's true. It it is probably the most dominant genre.
and has been for thousands of years.
Yeah, been for a long time.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Like it's funny, like not to get to a downer note, I guess, but it just genuinely saddened me that people just won't do it, that they won't give it a chance. And it's fine if you like end up not liking it. Although you would have to not like a lot of stories to not like all of fantasy, as we've said. That's like I'm not saying that, oh, you have to like fantasy stories. You probably do,
No.
whether you admit it or not, but you don't have to. It's fine. It's more just this idea that people don't want to allow themselves to enjoy the fantastical that's sad to me.
Yeah. Allow yourself to be open, think about new things, even if it's just a change as small as instead of saying, "Oh, I don't like fantasy," being like, "Yeah, I stopped trying to read fantasy because everyone I've tried so far I didn't like, and I've only got so much time." It's like, that's fair. That makes sense. Maybe you don't like it, but even if there's another one you could like, it's fair that you're not continuing to try to pour more time into something that hasn't worked so far. But at least if you think about it that way, one might just drop under your nose one day that you do like, and you'll look at it instead of immediately turning your nose up at it.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, look at reality, guys. Reality sucks.
Why do you think fiction and especially fantasy are so popular?
Like, allow yourself to delve into a world that's not our own for 5 minutes and forget that all this other bullshit exists. Not forever, because we need to remember the bullshit very much. But yeah, I don't know, man. Like, I can't conceive of this idea of not wanting to let the fantastical into your media and being so constrained by reality because fiction is the only place where you can leave reality behind.
And everybody needs a little bit of that sometimes. And I think reading a little fantasy is a more healthy escape than turning your brain off with large amounts of alcohol and the lazy boy in front of the TV.
Yeah.
You can also technically do that with fantasy because there's nothing stopping anybody from getting drunk watching Game of Thrones or any number of other things. But,
You,
at
you
least
you
then
can't tell me that reading Tolkien whilst high wouldn't be an experience.
I'm kind of scared of that thought. I don't know where I would go if that happened.
Gollum's not real. Gollum's not real.
Oh God. Andy Serkis isn't real. Andy Serkis isn't real.
No, he's real and he's very cool.
Ac accidentally flip to a show like with an interview of Andy Serkis in the middle of thinking about going, oh, Andy Serkis.
All of Andy Serkis's roles start blending together, and suddenly you have got Claw in the MCU replaced by Gollum, and Gollum replaced by Kino from Andor.
I'm just imagining somebody waking up from a horrible nightmare about Gollum now and just being like, no, Andy Serkis, I'm not a fish. Don't bite me.
Oh God. Yeah, I mean that's basically the intro that I wanted to get into for the cycle. I mean, there's a lot more we can talk about when it comes to fantasy because it's so broad. We've not touched on any of the common tropes necessarily, just acknowledged that they exist. We've not talked about world building. We've not talked about magic systems, but we probably won't do magic systems too much because we've already talked about them and it for an entire like cycle. And we can touch upon them. We did horror twice, but given how big fantasy itself is, I don't think we should focus on it.
No, definitely not.
But I think this was a good starting point for the cycle to get into this idea of just before we start approaching specific stories, taking a battering ram to that idea, to the preconceived notions of what fantasy is and can be, and who can enjoy it.
Yeah, if you think fantasy is just Lord of the Rings, this is your rolled up newspaper. Stop it.
Will we still mention Lord of the Rings many times throughout the rest of this cycle? Probably. It is foundational to modern fantasy, but it's not
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah, it's not something you can just avoid and ignore, but it's far from the only thing there is. And for anybody who doesn't know, and this is true of the vast majority of great authors too, the man himself would never want it to be the only one.
No, what's the point of it all this retreading the same ground?
Tolkien would probably be horrified by by just how much he's been aped and imitated, or specifically by the people who have this rigid definition that's just what he made.
Then again, he has some very specific ideas about things like dragons.
Well, I mean, listen, Smaug has that smoldering gaze sitting on his pile of gold, and people feel a certain way about that.
Yeah, like I don't want to attribute too much leniency and open-mindedness to the man because he definitely had some stuff that he felt very strongly and very specifically about.
Yeah, but he's also definitely not a man who would want everybody thinking the exact same way as him, and at the very least, not because of him, not because they thought what he made was all there was.
Yeah. No writer wants to read their own story a million times because no one else is doing anything else.
Hell no.
Anyway, but yes, I think this was a good opening point, but we can probably leave it there.
Yeah,
If you are watching or listening to this over on YouTube, Spotify, Podbean, Apple, wherever, you can also find these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com. I also share stories and poems and things like that there. You can buy my books there. And basically, if I do it, it's there. And that goes for all my collaborations with John too. But you can also find John on YouTube and Twitch as Sephir, Sephear.
that's me. Dragons and magic are really cool, and I like them.
Yeah, he's right. All right, goodbye.